call upon the stage Dr. Vijaya Pandit for the next session. Dr. Vijaya Pandit.
Hello. Now we move on to next session. Um, this is regarding case-based perspective. We have already seen some of the case-based studies, case-based presentations which have occurred. Now we move on to gestational diabetes. Presentation is going to be for case-based perspectives in gestational diabetes mellitus, focus on diagnosis and therapy. I call upon Dr. Rakesh Sahai for the presentation, please.
So good evening to all of you. Thank you, Chairperson. At the outset, I would like to congratulate my good friend Dr. Unnikrishnan for organizing such a wonderful meeting and for thank him for inviting me to be here amongst all of you. So I would discuss in the next 20 minutes or so, try to discuss about gestational diabetes, discuss about the diagnosis and management, particularly focus on that through a case that we will discuss about. So I would try to discuss different areas. Although I would focus on mainly on the diagnosis and management, but I will also give a brief overview of the pathophysiology and discuss a little about postpartum follow-up of these people with gestational diabetes. So let's look at this this lady who is 30-year-old. And she's Mrs. G, who's 30-year-old. She's married for 6 years, has a history of PCOS in the past. She's has a stressful job and works in the IT sector, like most people you would be seeing today. She was earlier seen for her plasma glucose values were normal earlier. Maybe a couple of years back she was investigated and or that was normal. She has however, she has a family history of diabetes in both her parents. And none of her siblings have diabetes. She has 2 siblings, but none of them have diabetes. Her BMI is 26 kg per meter square, and she's recently conceived. She visits the antenatal clinic. Do you think she needs to be screened for her diabetes, I mean for glucose levels, or do you think we should wait for some time and do it later? What does the hall feel? Yeah, we should screen her because we'll see. I mean, as we see that we are seeing that not only are we from, I mean, we are from a ethnic background which has a very high prevalence rate of gestational diabetes, because of which we would say that everybody needs to be screened, but also the fact that she has got several risk factors, as we will discuss about it. So gestational diabetes, we'll come back to her. So gestational diabetes, we could say, is defined as any degree of impairment in glucose tolerance, which is first recognized during pregnancy. So although we say that this is something which is detected during pregnancy or maybe happening during pregnancy, but there are many many instances where it may be not be de novo pregnancy induced, but it may be type 2 diabetes which is earlier existing, which was not identified earlier, which happens in about 30 to 40% of these women who may be detected for the first time may have that. 10% of them may have antibody positivity, indicating that they have some form of autoimmunity going on, and they have some form of say what we could call as type 1 diabetes or latent autoimmune diabetes, which can progress to type 1 diabetes. So something like that could be there in a small percentage, while many of them may be having pre-existing type 2 diabetes also. But whatever is detected for the first time during pregnancy, when glucose intolerance is detected for the first time, we call it as gestational diabetes. So as I said, it may be difficult to distinguish, but some of the pointers which would suggest that a woman may be having pre-existing diabetes, pre-existing type 2 diabetes, the pointers could be that if she has got a fasting hyperglycemia, or if the blood glucose levels are more than 180 on a OGTT, then you can think that, okay, this could be a situation where there was pre-existing diabetes. Or if you can see clear-cut signs of clinical evidence of insulin resistance, HbA1c is more than 5.3, or a systolic blood pressure more than 110, or a BMI more than 30 kg per meter square, or previous history of fetal anomalies in the past. So all these things can give us some indication that, okay, this lady may be having pre-existing type 2 diabetes. Then the clues for type 1 diabetes can be if the lady is lean and thin, whereas we would normally expect them to be little overweight, but if they're lean, if she's lean and thin, or she has she develops DKA during this pregnancy, or has severe hyperglycemia requiring large doses of insulin, then these could be pointers to say that, okay, there is some autoimmunity, and we may need to evaluate for that, and probably treat them more like type 1 diabetics than treating her like I mean being more relaxed in our management. So if we look at the overall picture of hyperglycemia in pregnancy, so now because of this overlap and all that we see, we are tending to use this term called hyperglycemia in pregnancy rather than calling GDM or diabetes, because we're not sure whether it's pre-gestational diabetes or GDM. So hyperglycemia in pregnancy, if you say hyperglycemia in pregnancy is probably becoming one of the most common medical conditions in pregnancy, and 1 in 6 live births have some form of hyperglycemia associated with them. So this is the extent of this problem, and 84% of this is because of GDM, but there could be, and the remaining is because of pre-existing diabetes. And as you can see, the high prevalence is associated with the fact that with advancing age, maternal age is a very important, very strong risk factor, and as you can see that as the maternal age advances, the prevalence of hyperglycemia goes up almost from 9% in a lower age group of 20 to 24 to about 45% in the age group of 45 to 49. So that's how the prevalence of GDM increases. And if you look at the Indian scenario itself, you can say that our country has a much higher prevalence. As you can see, across the board, you see that the minimum is probably 12% or so, and it goes up to about 20%. So that's a pretty high rate if you see. And if you look at the worldwide prevalence, there are some places where the prevalence is much lesser. So Indian women have 11.3 times higher risk of developing gestational diabetes as compared to white women. And it is also thought that, if you look at the lowest prevalence rates, they are in the range of 2% or so. So that's why there's a need for heightened, more awareness of this problem and better management, earlier detection, and just to look at what causes this problem in pregnancy. So if you look at a normal pregnancy, on the left side of the chart, you can see insulin resistance, insulin secretion are balanced. This is a normal woman who's having normal blood glucose levels, and in pregnancy, what happens to this woman who goes through pregnancy is that there is increase in factors like TNF alpha, human placental lactogen, which is a normal physiological phenomena that happens in pregnancy, increase in progesterone levels, increase in leptin levels, and decrease in adiponectin levels. All this leads to increase in insulin resistance. And to compensate for this, there is a significant, there is a equivalent rise in insulin secretion to compensate for that insulin resistance. Why is this happening? This has got certain benefits to the fetus. It helps in providing nutrition to the fetus, and because of this, there is compensatory increase in insulin secretion. And in a woman who is able to match this insulin resistance with increasing insulin secretion, does not develop gestational diabetes, has normal glucose levels, and goes on normally. So this is, but in a woman who develops gestational diabetes, this is because the insulin secretion is not able to match up to that requirement, and because of that, what happens is that there is a tilt in the balance towards increase in blood glucose levels, because the insulin resistance is increasing. And so this could be either because of inability to compensate for that for the increased insulin resistance by lack of production of insulin, or it could be because sometimes the insulin resistance itself can be overwhelming, in the sense that can happen in women who are obese, overweight, who have a previous history of PCOS, who are offsprings of women who had gestational diabetes. In all these situations, the insulin resistance is very significant, and that could be the reason that this balance is tilted in the direction of gestational diabetes. As you can see, this very pictorically shows us what happens in normal pregnancy above. There is an increase in the pancreatic beta cell mass, increase in insulin production, and then that goes back to normal after delivery. But in a woman who does not who's not able to produce that, develops gestational diabetes, who's not able to compensate for that insulin resistance, develops gestational diabetes, and continues to have some degree of beta cells dysfunction subsequently also, can present with diabetes later in life. So who are all those who are at risk of developing gestational diabetes? Those with a family history, with a first degree relative, those who have a pre-pregnancy weight which is more than 110% of the ideal body weight, or in simple terms, who have a body mass index of more than 25 or more than 30 is definitely a very significant strong risk factor. Age greater than 25 years, previous history of a baby more than 4.1 kgs, or personal history of abnormal glucose tolerance. Apart from that, it could also happen in women who have had PCOS, who are using glucocorticoids due to some reason, who have essential hypertension, or those who are from an ethnic group like ours, where we are at a very high risk of gestational diabetes. And as compared to background populations, as I mentioned, if you look at the Swedish population, the rates of GDM is only 2% there, and as compared to our population, where we have almost about 5 to 6 times higher prevalence rates. So that's the reason why we see that we need to screen. We need to do more of universal screening in our population as compared to selective screening recommended in such populations where the rates are low. But however, there's a lot of confusion. Even we think that only we have a lot of confusion about gestational diabetes between the criteria to be used for diagnosis and all that. But the confusion is there worldwide. And if you look at it, the reasons are because they have recommended selective screening. Who has to be screened is not very properly defined. If you look at the different organizations recommend different cutoffs of the BMI. Some have recommend 30, some recommend 25, some recommend 35. So they are not very sure about what cutoff has to be used of BMI for doing that, or what maternal age is the risk factor. Some organizations like AD have recommended more than 25 as a maternal age cutoff for screening for GDM. So that confusion is there everywhere across the world. It's not only in our country. We are at least clear that we need to screen all women who go through pregnancy for gestational diabetes. So let's come back to our patient who came back with normal values at screening. So she came in the first trimester. We did her blood sugar values. It was fasting was something like 80, and postprandial was say 116. So what do we do now? What do we tell her? We tell her to, okay, forget about diabetes, just go about, be as normal as possible, or what do we say? Yeah, so we need to repeat her screening, but before repeating the screening also, what we have to give her is we have to give her proper advice on her diet and physical activity, because we have seen that she has got several risk factors. She is obese, and she also has a family history of diabetes. She has got a previous history of PCOS, so she's at very high risk. So even though her levels have come normal, we are not going to tell her that you come back we are going to tell her that you come back at 24 weeks, but we are also going to give her advice on diet and physical activity, because it has been clearly shown that proper dietary advice given in the first trimester to such women can reduce the progression to gestational diabetes, can reduce the progression by almost about 30% reduction in the progression to gestational diabetes can happen with dietary and dietary advice and advice on physical activity given in the first trimester. So that is very important. So we shouldn't lose out on the opportunity that we have here, that she has normal glucose values and she has got a very high risk. We know that she has got a very high risk, and we have to give her the proper advice. So now she comes back at 24 weeks. Do we need to do a OGTT? We need to do a OGTT here. And what we see is her fasting value is 105, and 1 hour value is 173, and 2 hour value is 142. So she came to a good setup like here in one of the best setups, Chalaram's Diabetes Institute, and we see that she has got a 2 hour, 75 gram OGTT with 3 values done. So, see what do you see? What do you say with this? We would diagnose her as GDM because she has got a fasting which is more than the 92 that we are looking at. Even though the 1 hour value is less than the 180 and the 2 hour value is less than the 153 that we are looking at, we still diagnose as GDM because she has got a fasting value which is higher. So what would have, so does she have GDM? Yeah, we are clear that she has got GDM. Does she need treatment? The question is, does she need treatment, and how to treat her? So diet is the important thing that we have to advise to her. We already advised her diet, but we would like to reinforce that advice and see whether she can optimally follow the diet that we are advising her, and see whether she needs treatment. So if you come back to screening, and as we said, the lower risk populations don't require screening. The average risk populations recommend screening at 24 to 28 weeks rather than doing it in the first trimester, as we do it. In the high risk population like ours, we do it in the first trimester itself, right, the first visit itself. And then there are several organizations. We look at different organizations, they have different cutoff values for diagnosing gestational diabetes. But the important ones are the WHO, which says that you look at WHO, or you look at the IADPSG. IADPSG, if you look at the IADPSG in the lower part of the panel, says you do a OGTT at 24 to 28 weeks, and then you see a fasting value of more than 92, 1 hour value of more than 180, or a 2 hour value of 153. Any one of them is correlating with the, can be diagnosed as gestational diabetes. And if you look at our own Indian criteria cutoff that we are using the DIPSI criteria, that is Diabetes and Pregnancy Study Group of India. They have come out with a simplified version of the for diagnosis, because what we need to see is that the challenges that we have are in terms of the numbers of people and the accessibility to many rural areas and places where we have less resources. So if you're looking at doing universal screening in such populations, you need to have a simplified test. So the simplified test suggested is doing a 75 gram OGTT with doing just a single value, single post plasma glucose value at 2 hours after the glucose value. And if you're looking at less than 120 as absolutely normal, 120 to 140 is like, is a gestational glucose intolerance, and more than 140 is definitely GDM. So this is what we are looking at, and we are doing it right at the time of the first visit. And if it is negative, then you do it at 24 to 28 weeks, and then repeat it again at 32 to 34 weeks. So this is what is recommended, and this is called the one-step procedure. And the advantages of that is that it is suitable for an Indian setting, saves time, less cost, avoids repeated visits, because the woman doesn't have to come back again. Even if she comes on the day when she comes, it can be done immediately without even waiting for fasting. That's what is recommended, and reduces the repeated sampling. So this is practically good for a low resource setting. If you go to a government hospital where you have got 200 people waiting in the OP, you can't do a 3 test for each one of these people. Then it would be too labor intensive and too much of time taken for that. So in such situations, you can do a scenario, you do this. But where you have got facilities to do it, you have got 3 women to be screened on a particular day, a good lab setup, then you do the fasting 1 hour and 2 hour values with the 75 gram glucose. So this is the Government of India recommending the DIPSI. They are recommending one-step universal screening during pregnancy, and they are also providing glucometers in this national program to screen all women. So that's the guideline that came out, the Indian guideline for gestational diabetes, brought out by the Ministry of Health. So they recommend, again, as I mentioned, screening at the first antenatal visit, then repeating. If it is positive, then you treat them as gestational diabetes. If not, then you screen again at the 2 other times that you are looking at, 24 to 28 weeks and 32 weeks. So why do you need to treat? We need to treat because there are significant short-term and long-term consequences both to the mother and to the fetus. To the mother, there is increased risk of hypertensive disorders, preeclampsia, problems during labor, and also subsequent problems in the postpartum period and beyond. And to the fetus, there are definitely risks involved in terms of when it's early in pregnancy, it can lead to congenital malformations or neonatal complications and long-term problems that are listed out here. And the HAPO study has actually brought out that there is a significant increase in these problems as the maternal glycemia increases. So having looked at that, let us quickly go on to the management in the remaining 8 minutes that I have. So what are the major issues on management? One is educating the woman is very important. You need to educate them about what has to be done, about the dietary changes that have to be done, the physical activity that can be increased within the limits of physical activity that is allowed, and pharmacological therapy in terms of, and how they should monitor and keep their glucose levels under control. So that's the important issues. Apart from going to the gynecologist, getting fetal monitoring done, ultrasound monitoring, and planning on delivery, and those issues I will not discuss on. I would mainly discuss about the glycemic management. So the glycemic goals that we're looking at is a fasting value of less than 95, a 1 hour value of less than 140 if you're doing a 1 hour value, and if you're doing a 2 hour value, then you're looking at a 2 hour value of less than 120. These postprandial glucose values correlate very well with the macrosomia or with the weight of the baby, and also they correlate very well with the shoulder dystocia or the problems during delivery. So, so this is what we're looking at. If you're looking at HbA1c, we're trying to keep it below 6, and at the same time, we're trying to avoid hypoglycemia, not causing a increased risk of hypoglycemia. So, if you're able to achieve these targets, then probably we can, keep the birth weight between 2.5 to 3.5 kgs, which is the ideal birth weight that we're looking at in our population. So how do we do that with medical nutrition therapy? What we need to look at is that even in obese women, what we need to do is provide at least a minimum of 25 kilocalories per kg of ideal body weight, with restriction of carbohydrates to about 40% of the diet, and moderate physical activity. And then you try this out for 2 weeks with the diet and exercise. If it doesn't work, then you need to go into intensification with insulin. That's the standard of care. That's the therapy of choice. While we will discuss about the oral hypoglycemic agents also, but this is what we would like to do. And regarding the medical nutrition therapy, what I would like to say is that 80 to 90% of women are managed with this itself. And they may not require more intensification, they may not require insulin, or they may not require any of the other drugs to be used, as long as they are able to follow this. 80 to 90% of them are brought under control. And the important issue is that as pregnancy advances, glucose intolerance typically worsens, and patients may ultimately require insulin therapy. And as I also mentioned earlier, that at least 30% progression to gestational diabetes can be prevented by early advice on proper nutrition in pregnancy. So I'll not go into too many details of this because of the time constraints that we have. Now coming back to our patient, she was advised diet and physical activity, and she was reviewed after 1 week. Actually, the blood sugar values came to normal, were maintained very well. 88, fasting of 88, a 2 hour post breakfast was done 118. So she was advised to continue diet and exercise. As we see that she was controlled with this, but we have to nevertheless tell them that they can have a progression of, can have further increase in the glucose values as pregnancy advances because of the increase in insulin resistance that happens. And therefore, they have to still be vigilant, and they have to do self-monitoring of blood glucose. How do they do that? You would ask them to do frequent, at least 3 times a day, or at least twice a day. You should ask them to do it. Do it at different times of the day. What we are interested in is the post-meal values. All the 3 meals they should do the post-meal values, and also do the fasting. So one fasting. Pre-meal values probably don't have that much of importance as the post-meal values. So we could ask them to do at least 2 of them every day, and watch the 1 hour values also if they can do that. So this would help us in identifying the glycemic control that is achieved, and this itself is very important. And A1C values are also important, but the self-monitoring of blood glucose is very important. So what happened to to our patient at 20? She comes back at 28 weeks. After 4 weeks, what we see is her post-breakfast value is 136, her post-lunch value is 148. She's doing her diet and all that, but in spite of that, it is increasing. So since we were asking her to monitor, she came back with these values. So what would you do now? Start insulin or give her oral anti-diabetic drugs? So start insulin is what we would generally look at, because the fasting is 109. We give her NPH insulin in the night, and pre-meal regular insulin. 2 times she received 4 units, because post-prandial was 136, post breakfast was 136, post-lunch was 148, post-dinner was all right. So she received this dose of insulin, this regime of insulin. So insulin dosing, as we said, that it's the cornerstone of treatment. Multiple different regimes are available. One dose doesn't fit all. What we need to look at is that the insulins that we can use are regular insulin or NPH insulin that's approved for use. But even the analogs have been shown to have benefit. And if you look at the long-acting analogs, Detemir is the one which has been used in pregnancy. And while we're awaiting still data on Lantus, which are not, on Glargine or Degludec, we don't have enough data. But we have data on the short-acting analogs and the long-acting analogs like Detemir. So they are all placed in category B, while Glulysin is still in C, and even Glargine is in C. So the different regimes that we can use are short-acting insulins can be used. Basal bolus can be used if there is a pre-existing diabetes, particularly they require basal bolus therapy. Even our patients he required a basal insulin with NPH and required regular 2 doses of regular insulin. So that's what she required at 34 weeks. Premixed insulins probably don't work very well because of the limitations that you have in terms of flexibility. I mean, you can't adjust the doses as per the requirement and you may have problems. But if somebody is controlled with that and is not able to take 4 injections, wants to take 2 premixed insulins, that may also be used. So insulin therapy has to be individualized, and the analogs also, as I mentioned, there is some evidence of the analogs being used. So now she comes back at 32 weeks. What is happening? See, if you look at her fasting has gone up again. Her post-meal value is 122, post-lunch, pre-dinner is 152. So pre-dinner also has gone up now. So what do you do now? She's getting 1 dose of NPH in the night and 2 doses of Actrapid in the or of regular insulin 2 times a day. So what do you do? So now because the pre-dinner is increased, we may have to add 1 more dose of NPH in the morning and also add the regular insulin at the dinner time. So that was what was done. She so this was how she got Actrapid 6, 8, 4 and NPH 4 and 8. So with that she went on and as I mentioned about insulin analogs, said that we both Lispro and Aspart have been found to be safe and efficacious for pre-meal use in pregnancy. Insulin detamir is also gaining adequate data is there on use of insulin detamir for providing basal coverage. So instead of NPH, you could use detamir, you could use Aspart or Lispro for instead of the regular insulin. And then is there a role for OHAs? Glibenclamide and metformin are the ones which have been tried. Why glibenclamide? Because of the fact that it has got very high protein binding, so it crosses less to the placenta. We have studies right from dating back to 2000 where Langer et al. Have looked at it. But the major problem was that it did cause a little bit of hypoglycemia in the neonate and macrosomia also. So there's a high rate of neonatal hypoglycemia, and a recent study has shown that this is inferior to insulin in terms of this composite of fetal neonatal hypoglycemia, macrosomia and hyperbilirubinemia. I'll just take few more seconds. Metformin freely crosses the placenta. Concentration is about 40 to 50% of that in the mother, and effect of metformin on fetal insulin resistance is not known, and it is a category B drug. It has been, in fact, our Indian guideline recommends the use of metformin in the 2nd and 3rd trimester. But what is the problem with metformin? Why not use metformin? Because we have been using it so much in all our patients with diabetes. So the issue that is that what we are seeing is that when you follow up these offsprings, you find that these people at birth they tend to be having lesser birth weight, but later on they tend to have a little more fat, these offspring. So we don't know about the long-term consequences. That's why we have a little bit of concern about using metformin. But otherwise, metformin is also approved for use by the Indian Ministry of Health recommendation that came out. So this is what we could say, that glibenclamide is clearly inferior to both insulin and metformin, while metformin performs slightly better than insulin. According to these results, glibenclamide should not be used, and if at all, you should use insulin or metformin. So that's what the current thing is. Now this patient came back at 36 weeks. The obstetrician wants to give her betamethasone for lung maturity. What do you do? How do you manage this? Her sugar levels are absolutely normal right now, but still she requires an increase in dose by about 20 to 30%, which may need to be tapered off over the next 4 to 6 days. Some of them just require for about 2-3 days only. Some of them may have a rise for about 6 to 7 days. But by and large, this is the Canadian recommendation. Canadian Diabetes Association has given a recommendation that this is how you should manage. You should increase the dose by about 25% on the same night. Then you increase by 40% on the next day, day 2 and 3, and then gradually bring it down. So this is how they recommend the management with that. So now this lady had a C-section at 39 weeks. Baby was 3.1 kgs. The baby had only 1 episode of hypoglycemia, which was managed with 10% dextrose. Otherwise, was all right. So what do you say? What are the future risks to the mother and child? Do you have to follow them up or no? Yes, you need to follow them up because in the child you have you have to look at birth, you have to look at the polycythemia, hyperbilirubinemia. These are issues that can be there. They also depend on the extent of glycemic control that was achieved, the hyperinsulinemia that is there in the mother, in the child. And later on in later in life, we are also seeing that there is increased risk of adiposity, obesity in children, and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And these are all risks related to the fetal programming that is happening during pregnancy. The extent of glycemic control that was achieved is going to decide how much of risk they have. So if a mother had a very good control, then she's less likely to have, the children are less, the infants are less, or these offsprings are less likely to have these problems later in life. Future risk to the mother, recurrence of GDM is a likelihood, and then development of type 2 diabetes is a issue. 20% develop IGT postpartum, and 3.7% develop diabetes at 6 months. As you see, as you go on and follow them up, over 5 years, about 50% of them may develop develop type 2 diabetes. So we have to be vigilant about that. We have to inform them about the possibility of preventing diabetes by modifying their lifestyle, losing weight. What are the who will progress to diabetes? So it is those with who had a higher gestational requirement of insulin, who had diabetes at an earlier gestational age, higher fasting plasma glucose, higher blood glucose on OGTT, those who had neonatal hypoglycemia, their neonates had hypoglycemia, those who had recurrent GDM, and also the most important predictors are the waist circumference and body mass. So those who are not able to lose weight are the ones who are going to come back to the pre-pregnancy weight, are the ones who are more likely to develop diabetes. So I would conclude by saying that gestational diabetes is a common problem, and risk stratification and screening is essential. Tight glycemic control will have long-term benefits. Transgenerational benefits can be seen. Thank you all for the patient hearing.
Thank you, doctor. It was wonderful lecture. He has really taken us through a pre-gestational phase, throughout the gestation, and even post-gestation, how lady has to be taken care and child has to be looked into. Any questions?
Sir, I would like to know we know the diagnosis range for GDM, but after giving insulin, what should be a range to maintain?
Yeah, as I was mentioning about the targets that we need to maintain in women who are either receiving insulin or even on diet and or even on metformin, what you're trying to look at is keeping the fasting below 95 and a post-meal value. If you're looking at a 2-hour value, looking at 120, or if you're looking at a 1-hour value, looking at 140.
95, below 95, what would be the cutoff? So that we need
Achha, below 95, what will you don't want to cause hypoglycemia, so 70 is, you don't want to go below 70, and preferably 80 to 90 if you can keep it at that. That's what you're looking at. But suppose you're just advising diet, and if it is 80, 75, you don't have to be really worried, because 70, 75 is okay for a normal person. But if you're using insulin, you may be little cautious in terms of avoiding hypoglycemia, because these women are at a risk of hypoglycemia, and hypoglycemia can be detrimental. Recurrent hypoglycemia can be detrimental to the fetus.
And instead of SMBG, what is the role of CGM?
Yeah, CGM also has been, some studies have been done with CGM to help in identifying GDM also, and also in terms of management, because but the issue about management is that because it gives you retrospective information, it will not help you prospectively in terms of doing in terms of adjusting that, but still it has a role. It still has a role. Real-time CGM is also available nowadays, that may have better value in terms of adjusting the doses and management. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sahay, for that extremely clear presentation on a very vexing issue that we face. My question to you was, this lady you said started off with a PCOS. Suppose she's already on metformin and becomes pregnant, then do we at that point stop the metformin, or we continue it and then add on insulin, or just stop it and then go on to insulin?
Very, very interesting and pertinent question, because this is very often discussed, and there was a lot of debate on that, and often it was felt that metformin does have a very important role to play in terms of preventing GDM and all that. But meta-analysis of all, not only preventing GDM but also reducing early abortions and all that. But a meta-analysis of all the data that is available has shown that metformin probably doesn't do that, But if somebody has got, if she had impaired glucose tolerance earlier, then metformin would have been a very good choice. And if she was on metformin, then you probably you would you have a role. I mean, you have a reason to continue the metformin. But if she had normal glucose tolerance, if she was using metformin only for improving her chances of conception and all that, then I think we could just stop it after conception.
Thank you.
Sir, the same question in the sense that I had one patient who was already on metformin. We don't know whether it was just for conceiving or she had abnormal glucose tolerance. But maximum dose of metformin that can be increased during gestational diabetes.
Yeah. So maximum dose of metformin that has been used, again 2 grams has been used in different studies. 2 grams has been the maximum dose. But the lower the better. If you can go with 1 gram, that may be better than giving 2 grams. And since we don't have very definitive evidence that it does prevent gestational diabetes or prevent early abortions, so I think there is no role if there was no clear-cut indication, like the glucose tolerance is normal, like in this patient, then there is no need to continue metformin in the early part of
And
pregnancy.
in such cases, can we combine or can we add NPH at night and continue metformin?
Yeah, probably we can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.